The year was 1946, and Americans were rejoicing after the end of the Second World War. The country was optimistic about the bright future ahead, but in Chicago, there was a threat that loomed over the windy city like a dark cloud, and this threat was much closer to home. Women were being violently murdered, and after a message scrawled in lipstick was left behind at one of the crime scenes, the headlines would soon dub the person responsible the lipstick killer. There would be 3 victims before a man was arrested in connection with the crimes. It seems like justice was served, but decades later, doubts about his guilt emerge. Is it possible that investigators got the wrong guy? Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I am, believe it or not, Joe, the host. I don't sound normal because I'm sick, but I promise it's me. Normal people, when they get sick, they get like a scratchy voice or may lose it altogether. I just turn into like a grizzly bear. I sound like I should be hosting a late-night soft R&B show. All right, as you slip into that bath, coming up for you, D'Angelo, SWV. But right now, it's Keith Sweat, making you sweat on The Quiet Storm. See, I could totally do that. And being sick is the reason you only had 1 episode last week. I was down for the count. But even though I don't sound the same, I'm feeling much better now. Before we get going with your story today, this is your official reminder to subscribe wherever you'd like to listen to podcasts and connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. Links are in the show notes of this episode, as well as at 10minutemurder.com. Now to the story. The first murder, attributed to the lipstick killer, took place on June 5th, 1945, and it didn't even make the front page of the local papers. 43-year-old Josephine Ross lived in a small Kenwood Avenue apartment in Chicago with her daughters, Mary Jane and Jacqueline. That afternoon, her daughter Jacqueline came home from work at her usual lunch. Upon entering, Jacqueline found the apartment completely ransacked. The drawers were pulled open, chairs were knocked over, and papers were scattered across the floor. But it wasn't until she rushed to her mother's bedroom that she found the most horrific sight. Her mother, Josephine, stabbed to death in the blood-soaked bedroom. She was stabbed in the throat, and her head was wrapped in a dress. But the most unusual part of the crime scene came when investigators found that Josephine's body had been put in the bathtub and all the blood washed off. The stab wounds were covered with adhesive tape. No unusual fingerprints were found on the scene. The police were stumped, and without a motive or a culprit to pin the murder on, the case went cold. Several months later, on December 10th, 1945, on Pine Grove Avenue, not far from where Josephine Ross lived, 33-year-old Frances Brown would become the next victim. Frances's body was discovered in her apartment by the housemaid, with a gunshot wound to the head and a butcher knife lodged through her neck from side to side. Her naked body was slumped over the bathtub, and like Josephine Ross, she had been washed of all the blood, and her head was wrapped in a cloth. Nothing seemed to be taken from the apartment, but 2 important and distinctive clues were left behind at the crime scene. The first was a message. On the wall, written in lipstick, the killer wrote, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." The press honed in on this detail of the gruesome crime scene, and news of the lipstick killer swept through Chicago. The next clue would be a bloody fingerprint smudged on the door jamb. This fingerprint would become very significant to the upcoming months as investigators try to piece together what happened. This time, the police had more theories and suspects. One possible theory was that the killer might be a woman. The police felt that along with the message being written in lipstick, the phrase, "for heaven's sake," seemed to have a feminine quality. Unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. The lipstick killer's most heinous and brutal murder happened just 4 weeks later, on January 7th, 1946, when an intruder used a ladder to enter a first-floor window of 6-year-old Suzanne Degnan's bedroom in the middle of the night and kidnapped her. A ransom note was found asking for $20,000 in cash. When Suzanne's parents realized that she was missing and reported it to the police, The police were quick to act, but it would be too late. Suzanne's head was found in a sewer a block away from where she lived. The police began finding her body parts in succession in different sewers and drains around the neighborhood. The murder of an innocent child left the community shaken and devastated, but as time passed and no arrests were made, the press and the public were beginning to criticize the way police were handling the investigation. Then, a man by the name of Richard Russell Thomas came forward. Richard was a nurse who lived in Chicago at the time of Suzanne's murder. He was imprisoned in Arizona for molesting one of his daughters, and as a nurse, matched the profile of the killer. During questioning, Thomas admitted to killing Suzanne. It would seem that police had a strong lead on Thomas, but as Thomas recanted his confession, authorities desperately shifted their attention to a college student caught fleeing from the crime scene of a burglary. William Heirens was a student at the University of Chicago. At only 17 years old, he already had extensive history of breaking and entering and had been arrested numerous times before. On June 26, 1946, while he was robbing an apartment, the police were called and he was placed under arrest. Certain that William was the lipstick killer, the police interrogated him for 6 consecutive days. He was beaten, starved, and refused the opportunity to speak to a lawyer. When William refused to confess, 2 psychiatrists gave him sodium pentothal without a warrant and without his or his parents' consent. Under the influence of the drug, William talked about an alternate personality that committed the murders. After his confession, the police claimed that despite handwriting analysis not being able to definitively link his handwriting to the lipstick message on the wall, his fingerprints matched the smudge fingerprints that they found at the crime scene. William Heirens took full responsibility for the 3 murders and was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He pled guilty to the charges, but would later recall that he did so to avoid the death penalty. William would go on to spend 65 years in prison. Decades and decades have passed since the chilling crimes, but doubts about William Heirens' guilt continue. There are several pieces of crucial evidence that don't seem to line up. His handwriting wasn't a match to the lipstick message left on Frances Brown's wall, and as for the fingerprint, police only had 9 of the 12 points of identification necessary to deem the fingerprints a 100% match. Some people don't even believe that the murders were committed by the same killer. Even with the inconsistencies and an interrogation that was clearly botched, it's hard to know for sure whether William Heirens was guilty of the crimes he was convicted of. What is beyond any doubt is that for the people of Chicago during that time, the lipstick killer was akin to a real-life boogeyman. And William Heirens never wavered during his time behind bars. He proclaimed his innocence until the day he died.